Inflation. Imagine in 2000, you could buy a gallon of milk for $2.79, a movie ticket for $5.39, a gallon of gas for $1.51. By 2020, that same gallon of milk cost around $3.50, movie ticket $9.16, and the gas averaged $2.17 per gallon. Your $10 bill bought less in 2020 than it did in 2000. This decline in purchasing power over time is inflation. If you had stuffed $10,000 in cash under your mattress in 2000, it would still be $10,000 in 2020, but it would only buy about what $6,400 could purchase in 2000. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises over time, subsequently eroding the purchasing power of money. It means each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services than it did previously. So how is it measured? It's measured by Consumer Price Index, or CPI. This tracks the average change in prices paid by urban consumers for a basket of goods and services, including food, housing, transportation, medical care, and entertainment. Also by Producer Price Index, PPI, measures price changes from the perspective of sellers, tracking costs for raw materials and wholesale goods. Personal Consumption Expenditures, CPE, the Federal Reserve's preferred measure, tracking actual consumer spending patterns. Core inflation excludes volatile food and industry prices to reveal underlying trends. These indices compare current prices to a base year, expressing inflation as an annual percentage change. So, what are the different types of inflation? We have demand pull inflation. It occurs when demand for goods and services exceeds supply, pulling prices higher. This often happens during strong economic growth when consumers and businesses have money to spend. There's the cost push inflation. It results from increased production costs, wages, raw materials, energy that producers pass to consumers through higher prices. There's built-in inflation. Workers demand higher wages to maintain living standards as prices rise. Businesses raise prices to cover higher wages and current wages, creating a wage price spiral. Then there's hyperinflation, extremely rapid, out of control price increases, typically exceeding 50% per month. Historically, the most infamous hyperinflation occurred in Weimar Germany in 1921 through 23, where prices doubled approximately every few days at the peak. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries, and currency became so worthless it was used as wallpaper and fuel. Zimbabwe experienced severe hyperinflation from 2007 to 2009, with the monthly inflation rate reaching an estimated 79.6 billion% in mid-November 2008. The government eventually printed a $100 trillion note. The currency was ultimately abandoned. More recently, Venezuela has suffered hyperinflation since 2016, with the IMF estimating inflation exceeded 1 million% in 2018. Basic goods became unaffordable for average citizens, leading to widespread poverty and immigration. In the United States, in the 1970s, stagflation combined high inflation peaking above 13% in 1980 with economic stagnation. This was driven by oil price shocks, expansive monetary policy, and declining productivity. Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker ultimately broke inflation's back by dramatically raising interest rates, causing a severe recession, but restoring price stability. The post-COVID period saw inflation surge globally. US inflation reached 9.1% in June of 2022, the highest since 1981, driven by supply chain disruption, labor shortages, massive fiscal stimulus, and pent-up consumer demand. Here are a few causes of inflation. Monetary policy. When central banks increase the money supply faster than economic growth, more money chases the same amount of goods, driving up prices. Milton Friedman famously stated, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." There's fiscal policy. Large government spending, especially when financed by printing money rather than taxation or borrowing, can be inflationary. There's supply shocks, disruptions to production or distribution, like natural disasters, war, pandemics, that reduce available goods while demand remains constant or increases. There are exchange rates, a weakening currency, making imports more expensive, potentially triggering broader inflation. Then there are expectations. If people expect prices to rise, they may demand higher wages and make purchases sooner, which can become self-fulfilling. The effects of inflation are purchasing power erosion, the most direct impact. Savings lose value unless invested at rates exceeding inflation. There's fixed income harm. Retirees and others on fixed incomes suffer as their dollars buy less. There's uncertainty. Businesses struggle to plan when future costs and revenues are unpredictable. There are menu costs. Businesses incur expenses constantly updating prices. Redistribution. Debtors benefit, repaying loans with less valuable dollars, while creditors and savers lose. Wage negotiation. Workers demand raises to maintain living standards, potentially fueling more inflation. So check out the modern benefits of inflation. More economists consider moderate inflation, 2 to 3% annually, healthy for economies. It encourages spending and investment rather than hoarding cash, provides flexibility for wage adjustments, easier to give 2% raises when prices rise 2% than cut normal wages during deflation. Reduces the real burden of debt over time and gives central banks room to lower interest rates during recessions. The Federal Reserve and most major central banks target approximately 2% annual inflation as optimal for sustainable economic growth. But what about deflation? The opposite of inflation, falling prices. They might seem beneficial, but can be devastating. Japan's lost decades following its 1990s asset bubble burst featured persistent deflation. When consumers expect prices to fall, they delay purchases, reducing demand, causing businesses to cut production and employment, further reducing demand in a vicious cycle. Deflation also increases the real burden of debt. So, how do we control inflation? Monetary policy tools. Central banks raise interest rates to cool borrowing and spending, reduce money supply growth, and use communication to manage inflation expectations. Fiscal policy. Governments can reduce spending or increase taxes to decrease aggregate demand. Supply side measures. Policies to increase productivity, reduce regulation, or improving infrastructure can expand supply. Wage and price controls. Historically attempted but generally ineffective, often creating shortages and black markets. President Nixon, 1971 through 1974, controls temporary suppressed inflation, but created distortion that worsened problem when lifted. So, how does inflation address asset classes? Different investments respond differently to inflation. Real estate and commodities often appreciate during inflation periods. Stocks can provide some protection as companies may raise prices, though high inflation typically hurts valuation. Bonds, especially long term fixed rate bonds, suffer as inflation erodes the real value of future payments. Treasury inflation protected securities, TIPS, adjust principal based on CPI change. The inflation unemployment relationship, or the Phillips curve, developed in the 1950s. It suggests an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Lower unemployment correlated with higher inflation, and vice versa. This relationship appeared to break down during the 1970s stagflation, leading to more sophisticated understanding, incorporating expectations, and supply shocks. Today, central banks carefully balance these considerations when setting policy. With a global perspective, inflation rates vary dramatically across countries based on monetary policy, economic development, political stability, and resource availability. Developing nations often experience higher inflation due to less established institutions, currency instability, and supply vulnerability. Advanced economies with independent central banks, they generally maintain lower, more stable inflation. You're not going to want to miss what's next, and they did not teach you this in school.